In this video, we'll start talking about clustering methods, and in particular, we'll focus on the k-means clustering algorithm. So we're beginning the unsupervised learning part of our course where we don't have any output values or response variables. Clustering is an example of an unsupervised learning task because we generally just want to find natural groups in the data. We're not concerned about predicting some sort of quantitative response variable or categorical response variable, as we were in the supervised learning tasks of regression and classification. So the overall goals of clustering are to find underlying groups in data. And this can proceed in two main ways, the first way being the more prevalent. So the first way is to group cases together based on predictors. So for example, we might want to group together certain flowers based on physical measurements that we take of the plant. So this might be things like petal number, petal length, or color. Based on the distances of flowers from each other, we might be able to group flowers together, group cases together. Another way that clustering can proceed is to group predictors together based on cases. So for example, we might want to group together different physical measurements of flowers, that is, group together different variables. We want to see if different variables are related based on their observed values in different flowers. So usually clustering proceeds in the first way. We want to group together cases based on predictors by seeing how distant cases are from each other. So just to give a concrete example, this might be a data set that we have. We have 150 flowers, those are the cases, and we have measurements on different physical attributes of a flower, such as sepal length, width, and petal length and width. So a natural biological question that arises from this data is, can we discover new species of irises? So species corresponding to clusters. We want to discover new species of irises potentially, and we can do that computationally with clustering algorithms. So k-means is a particular algorithm for performing clustering, and let's give a general overview of the algorithm. So in k-means, we assign every case to exactly one of k clusters, and we have to choose k beforehand. So a good clustering is found by minimizing within cluster variation. So the mathematical setup is this. If C1, C2, all the way up through C capital K are sets containing the indices of the cases in each of the k clusters, what we want to do to find good clustering to minimize within cluster variation is to minimize this sum. This sum is the sum over all clusters of WCK, which is our way of mathematically denoting some measure of within cluster variation for cluster K. So the idea behind minimizing within cluster variation is that we want the distance between cases in a cluster to be as small as possible. That is, we want cases in a cluster to be as similar as possible. So we try to capture this mathematically with a quantitative measure of within cluster variation, this WCK, as shown at the bottom. The rightmost summation adds up over the p-predictors the squared Euclidean distance between two cases, A and B. We're subtracting their predictor values, squaring them, and adding them up. So we want this summation to be as small as possible, to make the distance between two cases as small as possible. The left summation adds up these distances over all possible pairs of cases in the cluster. And finally, we divide by the number of cases in the cluster in order to fairly treat bigger and smaller clusters. So that is the objective in finding good clustering, but how does the k-means algorithm actually proceed to find these good clusters? So the algorithm is actually pretty short. It consists of 4 steps broadly. The first step is initialization. So first we want to randomly assign every case to one of the k clusters. Second, we find the middle of the cluster. So for every cluster, for every one of the k clusters, we compute the cluster centroid. Usually this is the mean value of each predictor for all cases in the cluster. The third step is reassignment. So then we assign every case to the cluster with the closest, in terms of Euclidean distance, centroid. So we repeat steps 2 and 3 until the cluster assignments stop changing. And it's important to note that this algorithm gives a local optimum. Running this algorithm multiple times with different random initializations is key because sometimes different random starts will give different results, some being more optimal than others. More optimal meaning having a lower value of that within cluster variation. So we have to run this algorithm multiple times with different random initializations, and ultimately we choose the result that gives us the lowest within cluster variance. So it's helpful to look at some visualizations to understand what the algorithm is actually doing. So we have some example data plotted here. There are two predictor variables plotted on the x and y axes, and every point is a case. So step 1 is random initialization. We randomly assign every single case to a random cluster. That's shown with the 3 different colors. So in iteration 1 of steps 2 and 3 combined, step 2 is about finding cluster centroids. So for all of the cases in the green cluster, the orange cluster, and the pink cluster, we find the cluster centroid by finding the average x1 value and the average x2 value for the green, orange, and pink clusters. In step 3, we reassign. So we reassign every single case to the cluster that has the nearest centroid. So the orange centroid is indicated by the large orange circle, and the pink large circle indicates the pink cluster centroid, and same thing for green. It looks like all of the top cases are closest to the orange centroid, so they get reassigned to the orange cluster. So we repeat steps 2 and 3 in the next iteration. So in iteration 2, step 2 again, we refind the centroids. So now that we have reassigned all of the cases to the cluster with the nearest centroid, we recalculate the centroid. And we see that the centroids move closer to the natural cluster middles. So we repeat steps 2 and 3 until the cluster assignments stop changing very much. And our final results are shown here. We end up with a stable clustering of the orange cluster, the pink, and the green clusters. So note that it was important to run this k-means algorithm with different random initializations, different random starts, because we can get different results from different random starts. So each of these 6 panels shows that same data set resulting from a different random initialization, the clusterings that result. So we see that different clusterings do indeed result from different random starts, and the numbers at the top of the panel show the total within cluster variance, which we want to be as low as possible. So it turns out that 4 different random starts gave the lowest values of that within cluster variance to 35.8. Those are indicated with the red boxes. So even though the colors are different, it is the same clustering. We would take this clustering out of this pool of 6 different random initializations. So there are often many considerations in clustering, and in particular for k-means, we have to choose a value of k beforehand, which can be difficult. So usually what we can do to try and assess a good value for k, the number of clusters, is to plot that objective, plot total within cluster variation versus k. So at some point, increasing the number of clusters isn't going to substantially reduce that within cluster variation, so we'll probably try and pick k around there. Another point is that we often compute centroids with a mean. This is a choice too. We could have used a different summary statistic such as median or mode. And in fact, these are slight variations of the k-means clustering algorithm. Another consideration is what distance metric should we use to measure distance between cases? What we saw when we defined mathematically that within cluster variation was that we used Euclidean distance, which is very conventional, but we can consider different distance metrics. Different metrics give variables different importance in determining the dissimilarity between cases. And depending on the application, we might favor one metric versus others. And also along this point, the scale of different variables matters. And it'll be important for us to consider whether or not we should standardize our variables to have unit variance. And again, this will be sort of context specific. We'll think about whether it makes sense to standardize. Sometimes all of our variables are on the same scale and we don't need to worry about standardizing.